There wasn't email back then, but I have been receiving it for a very long time. And I'm glad, I'm happy that I have the opportunity to discuss this topic with you today. Now, can everyone hear me? Let's start with that. It's very rare for historians to give a talk and for someone in the audience, and as the person is giving the lecture about a topic in history, someone in the audience raises their hands and says, that's me you're talking about. That's exactly what happened to me last week as I was giving a lecture on the Armenian community in China. I was reading this letter written by an American soldier serving in the US Army in China after World War II, back home to his wife. And so this is happening, again, the letter was written in 1945-46. And in that letter, there's a reference to some guy named Harry Krikor Sadoyan. So and the author of the letter is saying, I just met this guy, his name is Harry Krikor Sadoyan, he's really cool, etc., etc. And we went to the bar together, and then went to the Armenian Center, and partied until morning, right? So I'm reading these lines a couple of weeks ago during this talk, and some guy in the audience is just waving. And I say, what the hell is happening right now? Like, I'm in the middle of a lecture. It's fine, there will be an opportunity to talk. And it turns out, the guy is Harry Krikor Sadoyan. He's 90 years old. That day was his birthday. So I met up with him a couple of days ago. We had breakfast, and his wife was with him. And the wife said, I told him, why are you going to this lecture? It's your birthday. And he said, no, I want to go to this, right? So it doesn't always happen, but it did happen last week to me. Today, I think it's going to happen a little more often, because I see a few faces in the audience of people who have been to Western Armenia with me. So there will be people in the audience whose pictures are going to be shown in the talk. Now, originally when I sent the proposal for this lecture, my intention was to talk and focus only on the Hidden Armenians, Islamized Armenians, whatever we're going to call them, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit in this lecture, to focus on that, and not really go too much into the politics of, Turkey today, and what has been happening in Turkey in recent months. However, as I was going over the pictures that I'm going to show now, I noticed that at least two people whose stories I'm going to be telling are in prison right now. One, the third, has just been released from prison. The current situation in Turkey, and particularly in the Kurdish populated towns and villages in the east and southeast, is one that is extremely underreported, and the horrors that are taking place there are hardly ever told. I was there a couple of months ago, and I will show some images from that period, and I want to share a little bit about what's going on the ground, because as you can imagine, this is also impacting, first of all, it's a major humanitarian issue, and a major human rights issue, and on top of that, it's also impacting some of the individuals that are at the core of the lecture and the topic I'm going to be covering today. So I will be doing a couple of things at once. And again, after the talk, please feel free to ask questions, and I will be happy to focus on whatever aspect you are more interested in discussing. Because I will be covering a lot of ground, that means that sometimes I will just mention certain things and move along. And then again, hopefully there will be an opportunity to come back to it. Now this is the introductory portion. I start with this photograph, which is one of my favorite photographs from historic Armenia. Over the past 5 years, 6 years, I've made around 25 trips to historic Armenia. And you will see my hands down most favorite picture very soon. But this is one of my favorite ones. And it is one of my favorite pictures because it brings together a group of close to 70 Armenian young professionals who volunteered for Birthright Armenia at some point in their recent lives, in the past years. So I generally go to Turkey, to historic Armenia for research. This was the one trip that I went on as a historical guide to a group of 70 young Armenians. And it has been a most memorable experience. And I'd like to start with this story, because I want to highlight, and because this story highlights some of the reasons why this is important and this matters to clearly to you here, and it also some of the reasons that emphasize why we have a lot to learn from the Islamized Armenians today in our diasporan reality. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well. But let's move along. So this is the group, the Birthright Armenia group that I went, essentially we crossed the entire historic Armenia all the way to Cilicia, all the way to the border with Syria last year, at a time when the conflict with the Kurds had just resumed. And with this amazing group, again, an amazing group of young Armenian professionals from all over the world. In this picture, we are in on Lake Van. This is the Guidebook Island. And this is the Armenian monastery, and the group essentially made a circle around the church to express solidarity with all the destruction that's been happening to these sites for different reasons over the years. Now, this is where I pick up my narrative, my story. That day, one day on that trip was particularly moving and poignant. We visited this Armenian genocide survivor, daughter of Armenian genocide survivor. She's close to 100 years old, in her home in a village near Diyarbakir Dikranagert called Chunkush. Anyone from Chunkush here? Very few people actually survived the genocide in Chunkush. In 1915, the Armenian population of Chunkush was deported, but they did not go too far. This was an exclusively Armenian town of close to 10,000 Armenians. Almost the entire population was deported, and almost everybody was killed nearby at a ravine, and their bodies were thrown into that deep ditch, ravine, that you will see later on. Very few people survived this ordeal. There are a couple of stories, one told by one of the gendarmes who were overseeing this murder, and the gendarme actually finds a beautiful woman who's lined up again to be killed and thrown into the ravine, and he essentially takes her away, takes her home with him. This woman, this girl in fact, cries for days and days, and then again, this is a gendarme telling the story. One time when they're doing a visit, they're going on their way to visit some family of the gendarmes. They're passing by the ravine, and this woman runs out of the car and goes into the ditch and throws herself into it. There are very few who survive this ordeal. And as I said, we know that what happened there because of the few who survived, and because of the few of the perpetrators who spoke out or wrote about it. But also because everybody in that town, everybody in that area knows about it. And it is one of those places where if you just stand and ask anybody who's passing by, or if you just ask people around in those towns and villages about Dudan Gorge, and you tell them what happened there, they will tell you a version of a story that is more or less about all the Armenians being thrown in that ditch, or falling in that ditch accidentally. Again, depends on what version you're hearing. Now, on that day, last year, we went with this group of students, young professionals, to visit that ravine, that Dudan Gorge. And after that, we visited this woman who lives in the Chunkush village, and she's the last Armenian in the village. So we visit her, And as you can imagine, this was a very moving experience for everyone. At the end of the day, as we're driving back to Diyarbakir, that's where we're supposed to stay. Can everyone still hear me? Okay. At the end of the day, as we're driving back, I was thinking, you know what? Tonight we have to do something that's a little bit more fun. Because this has been an extremely difficult day for everybody. So I want to organize a party tonight. And because what we were trying to do is bring together Islamized Armenians and this group from the diaspora. So I thought one of the best ways to do this would be bringing together Islamized Armenians and our group at a party. You know, put some Armenian music, eat, dance, you name it, right? Of course, I had no idea what's coming. So we go to the hotel. The situation in Diyarbakir was already bad. We're supposed to meet at Surkiragos. We can't because of the security situation in the city. So the Islamized Armenians, they come to our hotel. We have the hotel hall for our party. And we have around 10 Islamized Armenians from Mush, Sasun, Diyarbakir, Dikanaget, and where else? That's it. The majority from Diyarbakir, a few from Mush and Sasun. Now, again, they're serving food. It's like everything is going as planned, at least as I had planned in my mind, until one of the Islamized Armenians says, I want to say something. He goes up there and he starts addressing the youth, and he starts telling them, when I look at you, I see in your eyes the eyes of my parents and grandparents. And he tells them, when I look at you, I get strength from you. When I see this many Armenians gathered here with us, this is a very rare experience for me, because generally what we get for being Armenian or expressing our Armenian identity is hatred, is curses, etc. Now, he spoke, and then everybody else wanted to speak as well. So we have, 9 others getting up there saying very similar things. This group included 2 women. In fact, a lot of the stories of Islamized Armenians are stories of men, especially the people whom you see, in documentaries, in films, being interviewed most of the time. But there's a lot of women as well who've gone through this ordeal. And again, it was important for me to invite some of them also to be there. One of them is a singer with a beautiful voice. And that night she sang an Armenian lullaby. So everybody is going up there and giving speeches. And as you can imagine, halfway into it, my party idea is at this point crashing, right? And then, now, the group, several people from the groups want to talk. And again, I say, sure, this is not turning out to be the party that I wanted, but you guys want to do it, let's do it. So again, one girl gets up from Canada, and she says, I took my culture and my language for granted my entire life. And looking at you, and now she's addressing the Islamized Armenians, right? And seeing the sacrifices that you go through to learn about your language, to learn about your culture, I see a lot that I can learn and can be inspired from you. And then another guy gets up, and he says, on this trip to Western Armenia, he says, we've been going past and visiting these different historic Armenian towns and villages and cities, monuments, churches, ruins, you name it. And somehow, it was difficult for me to connect to all of this. He's American-born, 3rd generation. And then he says, tonight, as I heard you speak, addressing again the Islamized Armenians, I now get it. I now get what this is all about. And I now get that connection. You know, one of the most fortunate things in my life has been learning from my students, or learning from people who are supposed to be learning from me, at least in theory, right? And many of the people with whom I have been on these journeys have had that kind of impact on me. And one of the things that I learned from this trip, and I have been repeating it over and over again, are there, yes, there's a couple of chairs here if you want. And one over here. So one of the things that I've learned at that point, and and I've been repeating it ever since, is that we often think about Western Armenia, about this place where we can or should do something about or with. So generally the question is, what can we do about Western Armenia, right? And recently what I've been telling people is, again, stealing from American president, ask not what you can do for Western Armenia, ask what Western Armenia can do for you. And I say this because at this point in history, there might not be much that we can do for Western Armenia in the way we think about it, or some of us may think about it and others might think differently about it. But there's a lot that Western Armenia, with its ruins, and more importantly with its people, with the remnants of the survivors of the Armenian Genocide, can do for us. In the way we think about things, in the way we think about places, in the way we think about community. Because ultimately, when we are talking about the Armenian Genocide, when we're talking about the massacres and everything that happened and all the loss, the huge, tremendous loss that Armenians went through, a lot of it often becomes this kind of romanticizing of the past, this kind of telling these stories of loss only to emphasize the loss itself. And we often forget that there's something else to be learned there. So every time we talk about an Armenian church being ruined and destroyed, right, and try to get some kind of, again, this sense of, talk about the injustice and the extent of the injustice. At the same time, we forget a more important element and message there, which is that, the community life, what existed in those places, on those lands. And at the same time, how that translates into our reality today. Because we don't think about our churches or our community life the same way we romanticize what was in the past and was lost. We have things in the here and now that are important to appreciate and keep, whether it's the Republic of Armenia, and this was mentioned in the introduction, or the diasporan communities. And often, again, thinking about 1915 and its aftermath from a perspective of, this horrible thing that happened to us and it shouldn't happen and there should be justice, often puts us in a place where we forget some of the important messages that 1915 and its aftermath can convey to us. And again, the Islamized Armenians are one of those people who actually remind us of this. Because they're living near remnants of Armenian civilization, and they themselves are remnants of what happened there. In fact, in Turkey, in a lot of these places, they are referred to as the remnants of the sword. That's literally how they refer to them, the locals. They just think of them as people who the sword hit, and somehow these people, survived. Fell through the cracks and survived. So I'd like to invite you all tonight on this journey to not only thinking about what can we do and can we learn about Western Armenia, but some of the things that we can learn about ourselves and our reality in the here and now through the lens of the people and the places of Western Armenia. Because we are in places by and large in the diaspora where we do have the privilege and we do have more agency and ability to express that, and we often forget that and do not give it as much focus and attention. Now, I'm going to make a quick segue here to give you an idea about the devastation in the Kurdish towns and villages in the east and southeast of Turkey today, because again, this will be context to a lot of what I'm talking about. I will then talk about some of the Hidden Armenians. I'll make some, my argument clear at that point. At the same time, I will talk about how they have been affected from everything that's been going on. This is an aerial view of the city of Diyarbakir today. It has more than 1 million population. Those are the city walls, by the way. It is the longest continuous city walls in the world after the Great Wall of China. Before the Armenian Genocide, half the population within the city walls were Armenian. 2/3 of the economy of the city was in the hands of Armenians. And the Armenian Genocide was particularly brutal in Diyarbakir because up to 80 to 90% of the population was killed in the province and was not, did not make it all the way to the Syrian desert. So, this is Diyarbakir today. A city that has been in recent months, over the past year, a little longer than a year in fact, has been at the center of arrests, conflict between the Kurdish guerrillas, the PKK, and the Turkish military that has razed entire neighborhoods to the ground. So I will show you an image to illustrate that. You see those completely open spaces in the middle of nowhere? Let's compare. Look, as you can see here, it's entirely, it's all houses all over the place. You get the density here. It's a very densely settled city, as you can imagine. And then now look at this. I'm not talking here about one street. These are entire neighborhoods where the buildings were essentially demolished on top of the fighters that were essentially in those buildings, in those structures. And most of them were teenagers. Most of the people who were killed were teenagers who essentially declared self-rule in hopes that the Turkish government is going to go back to the negotiation table and continue the peace process with the Kurds. As you can imagine, in the old part of town, all this is at this point, so they demolished everything, and then they cleared everything. So all you have now is this like open space, right? One of these open spaces is right next to the Armenian Surp Giragos Church, which was renovated only a few years ago, again through the local Kurdish municipality and the Armenian community, Armenian Foundation in the region. Now, let me show you a couple of other images that give you a better idea. Look at this, and this is the same exact image. This is May 2015, this is May 2016. So we visited this area a couple of months ago. Some of these places are still inaccessible. You can't even get through. You can't even see it from the outside because they actually have put up curtains on the street for you not to be able to see what's behind, and the devastation is unbelievable. This is one image of, you see the curtain over there in the back, and then beyond that is that area that's been targeted. And this is a city that's been, over the past 6 years, I've spent countless days there. I've been there at least 20 times, and I've spent a lot of time there. This was a place which was constantly extremely active and extremely lively. And over the past few months, this would be an average day in large parts of Diyarbakir. This is another image of the Armenian church, Surp Giragos. And you see that open space next to it. All that entire area was, full of houses, just like the rest of the image. And this is the Armenian Catholic Church, which was also damaged from the recent conflict in the area. And this is an image of a Turkish military making the Grey Wolf sign inside the Surp Giragos church as a sign of their, controlling the site or dominating the site. Again, this is from the past few months. This is a more recent image. We cannot access the church at this point. It's still not accessible to the civilian population. The military has still, cordoned off this area and does not allow people to get in. But we do have some images. This is one of those rare images that we have, taken from the interior of the church of how it looks right now. But Diyarbakir only a few years ago was a place of hope. In fact, over the past few years, many of us have thought of this city as a very interesting and important experiment. Because this is the place where the local Kurdish leadership, the local Kurdish municipality, made some very interesting efforts to confront the past and to start a new process of dealing with the history of Armenians in the city and the history of other peoples in the city, including Assyrians, Jews, and others. Within the span of a few years, there was this effort to renovate the Surp Giragos church, which was completed some 5 years ago. And so again, all this is happening after 2010. The church was renovated in large part through the support of the local Kurdish municipality and the Armenian Foundation. This cost a couple $1 million. And Surp Giragos, which was and still is the largest Armenian church in the Middle East, became this point of gravitation for a lot of Islamized Armenians in the region. So, for example, in the first, in the day after the opening of Surp Giragos for prayer, and right the day after, 9 people were baptized. 9 Islamized Armenians were baptized and became part of that community. But not only that, but over the months that followed, an entire community formed around the church. We're talking about dozens of people, often hundreds of people, who were at different stages of their journey to discover their Armenian identity. Some were just curious about it. Some had just learned that they have family who's Armenian, or their grandparent or grandmother was Armenian, and they wanted to meet and gather and get together with these people, with fellow Armenians like them. Others went beyond that, and they started learning the language. Some converted. Some started learning more about Armenian culture. I've seen this transformation on the different visits that I've made to the area. Let me give you one example. It's one of my favorite examples. I met a man, his name is Armen, this is Armen. Some of you may have seen him, some of you may have met him. I met Armen first 6 years ago. He introduced himself as Abdul Rahim, with his Muslim name. And he says, but I'm calling myself Armen, right? That was his thing at that point. The next time I visited, and the next time, the following, and the time after that, every single time, Armen was gradually transforming himself. I see him next, and he says, I'm learning more about Armenian culture. I see him next, and I hear that he's also signed up for the Armenian language courses in Diyarbakir. So he starts, he has learned all these words, and he just tells them one after the other, the whole thing, right? It's like, etc. And that's it. He goes through the full list, right, in 10 seconds. And then, as years pass, as months pass, Armen is getting better in speaking the language. Armen is getting better in learning more and more about his culture. And he starts working at the Surp Giragos church. Pretty soon, Armen becomes one of the poster childs, in fact, maybe the poster child of Hidden Armenians. This is a picture of him from a couple of months ago, holding the New Yorker issue, which featured a photograph of him working inside Surp Giragos church. If you remember last year, the New Yorker in 2015, the New Yorker ran this amazing story by Rafi Khatchig about Diyarbakir specifically, the history and the present, and how it all connects. There are many examples like this. In fact, one of the stories that, when people talk about this poster child of Hidden Armenians do not mention, is that this story goes a lot deeper than just Armen. Again, a few years ago, I was going to go to the area called Lice, north of Diyarbakir. Again, this was an area that was where there were many Armenian villages and many Armenians living there. And in Lice, I wanted somebody to show me around. I was going to go up mountains, and it was like, this was a place where, again, it's like one of the hotspots, flashpoints of conflict between the Kurds and the Turkish military. So obviously, I didn't want to just like walk up mountains like that. So I asked Armen, whose family is from Lice, to see if he can recommend me anyone. And he said, oh yeah, I will ask one of my brothers to take you to show you around. And he gives me a phone number. I called his brother. It was a Friday. His brother was at the mosque. And so I reach him, and he says, yes, come meet me at the mosque, and we'll take it from there. I go there. His brother, I see the brother, he extends his hand, and he introduces himself. And he says, my name is Talat. Talat, mind you, is the mastermind of the Armenian genocide. Armen and Armen's brothers are the sons of an Armenian genocide survivor. Armen's and his brother's story is a story of a boy who survives the genocide, loses his entire family, and then has to live in Turkey, in a place where Armenians are perceived as enemies, as people who, towards whom there's a lot of hatred, etc., resentment, etc. So imagine, to prove his nationalist credentials, he names his firstborn son after the chief perpetrator of the Armenian genocide. And then he has other sons. And then again, because history has this powerful way of seeking revenge and taking revenge, his youngest son, Abdul Rahim, changes his name to Armen and starts this journey of gradually discovering his identity. Now, in a lot of these places, a lot of these hidden Armenians, Islamized Armenians, come from an extremely complex reality. A reality where oppression, enforcing a certain identity upon a certain group of people, is the order of the day. At the same time, this means that when we think about these people, and we think about the journey of these people, it's important for us to not try to force them into a certain box. And this is what I mean by it. Many people would say, I do not consider people who are not Christian Armenian. Therefore, I reject Islamized Armenians as being Armenian. Or they would say, there have to be certain things that Armenians should have or learn and know, etc. And we have these very stringent definitions of who is Armenian and who is not. In fact, sometimes these definitions become so stringent that most of us don't qualify. It's this amazing thing that we figured out of really dividing things up as we try to figure out what does being a pure, good, whatever adjective you want to use, Armenian means. But a lot of these Islamized Armenians actually challenge that. And they also make us think about what it means to be Armenian. What is the definition of being an Armenian? What does being Armenian mean? Does it mean that you have to know the language? Does it mean that you have to belong to a certain religious group? Does it mean that you need to have a certain kind of faith or approach or outlook? Does it mean that you need to have a certain political views? You have to be born or know certain things, whether it's a language or the music or this or that. What is it? And ultimately, when we ask this question, we think about how often we engage in this othering in our own midst. How often, instead of being inclusive, we try to find ways of leaving people out. And the Islamized Armenians are the best example of this. But ultimately, who is an Armenian? You know, one argument that I like and I love is that an Armenian is a person who considers themselves Armenian. It's as basic as that. An Armenian is not someone, an Armenian does not need my or your affirmation or some kind of staple by some kind of authority, no matter what authority we're talking about, whether it's religious or secular, to become Armenian. Let's take the example of Armen, for example. Or let's take the example of an Islamized Armenian who, over the past 5 years, 6 years, decade, went from not knowing anything about his culture or her culture to learning the language, converting to Christianity, learning more about the culture, and eventually maybe moving to Istanbul and elsewhere and marrying an Armenian and having an Armenian family. This Armenian, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was Muslim. He wasn't even talking about being Armenian. He maybe did not even know he's Armenian. But through this journey of, say, a decade or more than a decade, he completely transformed into an Armenian. So let's say on the first day this man finds out that he's a child or grandchild of genocide survivors. On that first day, all Armenians said, you know what, we don't accept you. You're not part of our group. Right? How different is that from the rejection and denial that those people have faced from the Kurds and the Turks and the others in whose midst they have lived? How different is it? And then, who gives us the right to tell people at a certain point in their journey that you don't qualify? And to tell them that, you know what, you're not good enough. You haven't converted. You don't speak Armenian. This is where it stops. That's where I draw the line in the sand. And who are we to tell a person's trajectory over the years? This is very much part of our reality as well. Sometimes we're happy and we share articles about some Armenian discovering his identity and coming back to his culture in Turkey, some Islamized Armenian. But at the same time, again, there's some kind of romanticizing in this. At the same time, in many of our communities around the world right now, there are many Armenians who are not going to Armenian school, they're not learning the language, they don't show interest in the culture, and eventually they are being lost to the community. And somehow, we're more open to accepting those people around us as Armenian than accepting someone who's struggling against all odds in the reality of what is today's Turkey, to change something in their lives and embrace this identity. And I assure you, a lot of these Islamized Armenians, if you tell them, I don't consider you Armenian, he would tell you, who are you to tell me if I'm Armenian or not? The Turkish state couldn't force me to stay away from my identity. Who the hell are you to do that? Of course, this is an important challenge for us. It's an important challenge not only when we think about the Islamized Armenians, because how many times in our days do we encounter them in our reality, in our midst? Most of the time this is important for us because we are a community that is extremely diverse. We are a community that comes from all walks of life. And we engage in this exercise of othering, and we engage in this exercise of rejecting the other with the same approach that we use often when it comes to Islamized Armenians. So it's important to think about them again. It's one of the things that the Islamized Armenians, one of the tools, one of the examples that the Islamized Armenians set as we think about this, that can be very helpful in our own lives. Some of these pictures are from Armenians in Dersim and elsewhere. This young man is the head of the Dersim Armenian organization, and he was recently arrested in Dersim for a few days, and then released afterwards. I love this picture. You see Che Guevara, the Che Guevara photo in the background. And he speaks some Armenian. He owns one of the nicest and my favorite bookstores in Dersim. Dersim is one of those places where many of you may have family, descendants who were either from the Dersim region or were saved because of Dersim. A lot of people from Khatchig and elsewhere ended up being saved and through the humanitarian channel through Dersim because of the help of the locals in that region. This is a sign from Turkey, again from recent months. It says, Kurds and Turks are brothers, but you guys are Armenian. So this is again an insult to, there is this discourse in Turkey that many of the Kurdish fighters, many of the Kurdish leaders are Armenian, and they're essentially betraying the homeland because of that, right? There's this effort to portray this as an Islam versus kind of discourse. And a lot of Armenians are actually, it's part of the way the hatred goes. Now, another thing that is important for us to reflect on is how we think about a genocide survivor. For a lot of us, a genocide survivor is somebody who made it. Someone who survived the genocide, escaped, ended up in the Middle East, or Lebanon, or Armenia, or the United States, or wherever, right? So, but often, we have cases where many of these survivors get out of Turkey just because of luck or circumstance. So sometimes you have members of the same family. One member would be able to escape. The other member would stay behind. Now here's my question. Who's a survivor? Only the person who escaped? How about the person who stayed behind? Do you think the suffering of that person is less than the person who escaped? Do you think that person who's living among the perpetrators, the person who's living among the ruins of his culture and civilization, had it any easier than the person who got out? And then let's think about the children of those survivors. The persons who were forced to stay behind, are they any different than the persons who escaped, who were forced to escape? If they had children, do you think if by mere chance and fate, if they ended up in Turkey and had children in Turkey, was that any of their control? And if their children decide one day to return to their Armenian heritage, right? Do they have less of a right to their Armenian identity than the children of a survivor of the Armenian genocide who lives in the diaspora, as many of you do, right? There's this very poignant story of someone I know who goes to Turkey, to Kayseri, Gesaria. Anyone from Kayseri here? So to Kayseri, to Gesaria, because that's his ancestral home. And there he asked if there are any Armenians. This is happening a few decades ago. He asked if there are any Armenian survivors alive or Armenians, and they say, oh, there's a matriarch of this family who's Armenian, you should meet her. So he goes to her house, and he meets this woman, and the woman brings photographs of her childhood. And this man, I know the person, he looks at the photographs and says, "This can't be you, because I grew up with this girl in Worcester, Massachusetts." And they say, "No, this is me. This is her." And turns out that they were twin sisters during the Armenian Genocide. A local family takes them in, takes the entire family in, on condition that one of the girls marries their son. And after the war, the family leaves, and that one sister, one twin, stays behind. And she becomes the matriarch of this entire family. And this man goes back to Massachusetts, and for the first time in decades, puts these two twin sisters on the phone, one from a nursing home, the other in a city in Turkey. Now, who's a survivor? It's very likely that you associate and you can connect more with the person in Massachusetts. But was this their choice? If we think about this from that perspective, a lot of our assumptions, a lot of the way we view Islamized Armenians disappears. Now, I want to focus next on a couple of other ideas. I will pass through this. By the way, these photographs are from the Pingyan village in Agan, where Misak Medzarens, the Armenian poet, was born. And again, these are from a couple of months ago. It was one of those experiences, you know, this is a place perhaps where I should say something a little bit about how I feel as I do this. As you can imagine, the first time you go to Western Armenia is very different than the second time and the 22nd time. But it's amazing how every single time, at some point, even when I'm walking around as this person who thinks that he's seen it all, there's something going to happen that's going to completely break you down. Some person is going to be coming forward with some story, some experience. Something is going to completely shake you as if it's the first time you're setting foot on in those lands. And walking in these streets where Misak Medzarens, the Armenian poet, was born and lived the first years of his childhood in Pingyan, in Agan. And thinking that, you know, like this village, this is a remote village, right? The people of this village have no idea that this great poet, right, for Armenians, the person who has so much significance for Armenians, actually lived in their village. You walk around, people are completely oblivious. And I often think about places like this. I often think about this village. You know, like I wonder if, you know, this is where Misak Medzarens first learned walking. Or this is where Misak Medzarens first sat down or first fell in love, right? And I wonder if it's possible for us to see the day when there will be a library in this village in the name of Misak Medzarens, where there will be a bust of Misak Medzarens in that little center of the village where older men sit and chat every day. And a lot of this is conditional on how we think about ourselves, our culture, our heritage, not just in Turkey, but in the here and now. I say this because if we want to take ownership of our culture, if we want to bring to life, back to life, much or something of what was lost 100 years ago, a lot of it starts here. If we don't know about Misak Medzarens ourselves, we cannot tell about Misak Medzarens to the villagers who are living there today, 4 or 5 generations disconnected from that abrupt separation that happened with the genocide. And in this conversation, the Islamized Armenians, the hidden Armenians, again, it depends on how you're going to term them. As you know, this is a process, and these people, you can't just frame them in one single spot and try to define them as such. Have a key role to play. These are some images from 100 years ago. Now I'm walking into territory of the person who actually wrote the book on this. So Matthew Kuranian is here. He has joined me on some of these trips, and he is the author of the Historic Armenia Guidebook, which is a tremendous resource for those of you who visit or who just want to visit in your homes. He has images of this place as it looks today. 100 years ago, even before that, even after that, in the 1920s and 30s, there were 5 monasteries in this area. It's in the Khatchig area near Gars. You see the 4 in the back, and the 5th closer to us. All of them built between the 10th and 13th century. Some 50 years ago, the Turkish military moves in here, they cordon off the area, they fill all the churches with explosives, and they blow it up. All 5. Sorry. I pressed wrong. This is another image of the 4 that are next to one another. Now pay particular attention to the largest one. Because as they blow things up, just one stands and survives. And I love this photograph because, first of all, it really shows the scars of this church. And there's something about the defiance of this image that often reminds me of Islamized Armenians. These are the remnants of the sword. These are the people who are scarred with a century of denial, a century of hatred, a century of othering. And then today, somehow, they're still standing and trying to stand up, while all around them are the ruins and the pieces of rocks and the souls and the remains and the ashes of people who did not survive the genocide. Now, my next stop on this journey, which is going to end pretty soon, so please bear with me, is again in the area near Diyarbakir, in a village called Satuker, or Satiker in Turkish. And so we visited here a few days after the opening of Surp Givargos. We visited this village because we were asking locals, and they said there's an Armenian church there that's still standing. In historic Armenia, a lot of the churches that are still standing are standing because either they serve a purpose, primarily because they serve a purpose, right? One, they may be serving as a mosque, they may be serving as a barn, some are even serve as refrigerators, right? People actually, because it's cooler inside, they actually use it as refrigerators, right? Now, this is one such church. This was an exclusive Armenian village 100 years ago during the genocide, and this church was converted to a mosque, as you can see. So we visit this place, and I'm walking, I'm that little guy there on that road, right, trying to take pictures from the different parts. That's the vineyard, by the way, of the church. As you see, 100 years ago, this place was, as you can imagine, was blossoming and very different from the way it looks right now. And as I'm walking there, I see this man coming in my direction in a tractor. So he stops when he sees me. He notices that I'm not like a local. So he says, "Where are you from?" I say, "I'm from the United States, but I'm Armenian." "Oh," he says, "my father was an Armenian who survived 1915. He was 10 years old. He was taken in by one of the families that came to this area. And he grew up and he married a local family, and I was born. The daughter of a local family, and I was born." Now, and then he did 3 things that will always remain with me. And again, this is one of my favorite stories from these trips. First, he said, "Can I hug you?" Now, If somebody random on the street comes up to you and says, "Can I hug you?" most likely you're not going to be very forthcoming. But for this man, he wasn't hugging me as the person. He wanted to hug me because at that point, in this remote village, it's very likely that he never even met an Armenian person. In fact, a lot of the survivors of the Armenian genocide who stayed behind, they were told, and we see this in account and memoir after memoir, they were told there are no more Armenians. That was one of the ways in which they were told, you know what, this is it, this is all you have. This is where you're staying, that's it. So he asks me, "Can I hug you?" And then we hug. And then he says, "Can we take a picture?" And we do take a picture, which is, hands down, my favorite photograph from Western Armenia. Now, I love this picture for many reasons. One is that I like huge pictures of me blown up on the wall. The second is that, just look at these two faces. These two people could very well be relatives. One is from one side of the Atlantic, the other is from the other. One lives in a city in wherever, at this point I don't even know where I live, Fresno. And the other lives in a remote village in the Arctic. And there's so much resemblance there. And of course, there's a tractor in the back, and behind the tractor, there's that guy who was like really very carefully, cautiously like listening in and trying to figure out what the hell is going on between these two people, right? You will always see this guy in Western Armenia, right? It's the archetypical guy who's curious about where you're hiding the gold, who's curious about, where you got these things from, who's curious about what the hell you're doing here and what's your business, right? And again, this picture captures them all in this one frame. But then he did something else too. At the end, I said, the Armenians used to gather here for Astvadzazin holidays, and there was this feast in this village. Do you know where they used to gather? And he said, yes. He said, walk, and again, we're on that road, and he said, walk in that direction for 200 meters, and you're going to find this open space. In fact, if you listen carefully, you can still hear their voices. So this is a man who drives his tractor every day past that field twice. And this is a man who, 100 years after the genocide, still hears the voices of their ancestors. Does not speak Armenian. There's no Armenian church in his village to go to. But how many of us would actually think of telling this person, you know what? You're not Armenian. Now, it's not always that you encounter remnants in historic Armenia. Sometimes you encounter remains. I talked about how in many places, I mentioned this, in Armenian churches, in Armenian houses, homes, there is constant effort to dig things up and look for gold and look for treasure. There's this obsession, right? This has been around for a very long time, and again, it's constantly reinforced. Most of the places that are still standing, they've been dug up all over. Most of the places that you go, there are these, ditches everywhere around. And this is because people are constantly looking for Armenian gold. There's a constant obsession with the gold that the Armenians left behind. And of course, when they see Armenians coming to these areas, they think that they're here for the gold. It's very difficult for them to imagine that people can actually make this trip and visit these places for something that is not really very material. At the same time, this search for gold has become such an obsession. In fact, Hrant Dink has this very powerful quote. Again, once he was addressing a Turkish audience, and he said, you keep digging and looking for gold under the ground. And you don't realize that the gold was on top of the ground, and you got rid of it. Yes. And it's very much like that. And to this day, you cannot show up in these places without somebody coming and telling you, oh, I can help you find the gold. Or, so where did your grandparents hide the gold? And most of the time, the majority of the time, obviously, right, these people dig places up and they find nothing. And even worse, as in this case, this was a remote Armenian church on Lake Van. I wrote about this without mentioning the church. I just didn't want people to go back there and keep digging. Where you can't even have access from land. You actually need a boat to get you there, because there's like this huge, from the back it's impossible to just climb down. And we got there by boat from the water, and then once we got there we had to again climb up to get to the place, right? And then we walk into this church, and at the narthex you see, everywhere it's dug up. And we see this like bowl-shaped thing in one of the ditches. And I tell my friend, do you think that's what I think it is? And he says, no, that should be a ball, right? And then we get close to it, and it's a skull. In the Armenian church, it was tradition often to bury the abbot, as in some other churches as well, in the monastery. And this person's rest of God knows how many centuries has been altered because some people have been looking for gold. And this is an unbelievable, aspect of this, which constantly is brought up. But here's the thing: not every time here's the thing: a citizen of Turkey can decide to go through life in two ways. One is to ignore all the signs and signals around them. And the other is to actually pay attention to it. And if the moment you start paying attention to it, there are these signals and signs everywhere reminding you of the Armenians who live in that land. So sometimes they come in the shape of churches or church ruins. Sometimes they come in the shape of skulls dug up from inside those churches. Sometimes, as in this case, in the city of Aintab, a Turkish man, anyone from Aintab here? Who is everybody else from? Where is everybody else from? I'm kidding. Yes, Harvard, right? So you have this person from Aintab actually, looking in some of the old Armenian houses in the city, and he finds this photograph. In this photograph of an Armenian woman, and in the back, it reads, Hankutyal Hevine, the wife of Kevor Chavush. This is given to such and such family. 1910 Aintab. So this is from 1910. So this man finds it 100 years later in a wall in an Armenian home in Aintab. Right? This picture of an Armenian woman, armed to her teeth. And this man's life is completely transformed because of this photograph. He wants to learn more about his city's history and the Armenians in his city. So he starts reading different books published in Turkey. He realizes pretty soon that the national Turkish state historiography is flawed. There's a lot there that is not being mentioned, right? So he goes and he wants to read Armenian books. And he gets a copy of an Armenian book called Aintabi Herosamarda. And he doesn't know Armenian, so he learns Armenian to be able to read the book. And then, last year, Aintabi Herosamarda was published for the first time in Turkish, and this was this man's translation. When I saw him last year in March, I asked him to bring this photograph with him, right? So he came up to me and he showed me. I said, I said hello, and then the second question was, where's the photo? So he pulls out the photograph, right? And he shows me the picture and says, this photograph changed my life. And I believe him. I believe him because you know what? One of the things that I have learned, meeting these remnants of 1950, whether it's the children and grandchildren of people who survived the genocide, whether it's the ruins that are standing in villages that continue to galvanize and captivate people who live in those villages, or whether it's these artifacts, pieces of paper, postcards, images that somehow protrude from the soil or from inside a wall, that there's so much power and agency in what we think about as the remnants of the Armenian genocide. And it has such a tremendous transforming power. It is the kind of transforming power that transforms the lives of the people that touch it or are interacted with it or interact with it. But also is hugely transformative for us, for us people in Armenia or diaspora or elsewhere, anywhere around this world where Armenian communities or individuals live. It transforms because there's something extremely raw about historic Armenia. And there's something about it that, and you know, some of you here have been on this journey with me. Like there's Eric Nazarian over there who's joined me several times. There's Bardik. You know what happens? You are never the same person again. There's something that changes in you that that makes you a different person. But at the same time, there's another journey that begins at that point. It is a journey of thinking about, and otherwise your experience is incomplete. It is a journey of thinking about identity differently. It is a journey of thinking about Armenianness differently, about Armenian culture differently. It is a journey about paying attention to things around us. We live in a country where the Native Americans were all but destroyed and annihilated in the course of a few centuries. We live in a country where the remnants, there are always remnants and reminders of this. But again, it's a matter of choice for us to pay attention to it or not, to ignore it and neglect it. And my experience, going to these places, has been one where, as someone who has gone to Armenian school since childhood, has been part of anything that you can imagine being the authentic experience of being Armenian, if there is such a thing, right? Whatever there is, I've done it. Not because it was a personal choice, but because I was just dragged into it, right? You're born in Lebanon, you go to an Armenian school, this is happening, in the 1970s, perhaps not anymore, but to the same extent. But you are part of this community, and you accept a lot of things, and you're part of a lot of things, and think about a lot of things in that context. And then you meet people who choose to be Armenian. And then you think about choice in identity. You think about agency in identity. And you think about your identity differently. And you realize that a lot of the people that you are encountering on this journey have done this not because they were born in an Armenian family. Not because they had to be this. There weren't that many options around, right? But because they choose to, against all odds and despite everything. This is a picture of, one of the groups that made the trip. And the woman in the middle over there in the back is the daughter of the survivor I talked about near that ditch, near that ravine. And you see Matthew Crane in the front, and some other faces that are most likely very familiar to you, Mouradian and others. And this is a ditch, the ravine that I talked about, where the Armenians from Chinkush were killed and thrown in there, and where everybody knows about it. Now that man who's standing there, sitting there, is the son-in-law of this woman. And so he married her daughter, and he is here in this, in this image. He's speaking to the ravine about the experience of his mother-in-law. Now this guy is in prison for the past 3 weeks. Again, you have hundreds of people in these areas, thousands of people in these areas who have been arrested for accusations of engaging in terrorism, aiding and abetting terrorism. Again, their only fault in most of these cases, not obviously all, but most of these cases, is being Kurdish and being involved in the Kurdish issue or other issues in the region. This is that man's son. So this is the grandson of that woman who's 100 years old. They live on a street called Monastery Street. And that street in Chunkush is called Monastery Street because there's a monastery that's still standing. And this boy, every single week, goes to the monastery and cleans it up. Because people just go there for, they have, it's a picnic location for some people, right? So it's like always dirty. So this kid, the grandson of that woman, comes to this monastery every single day, and the son of that man comes to this monastery every single day, every single week, to collect the trash from there. Now let me conclude with this story. Every time I think about this. So, I am standing on my very first trip to that ravine. I'm standing near the edge and just waiting. And whoever passes by, I just ask them, right? People see people standing there, right? These Westerners, standing near the edge. So they go and try to talk to them, right? So I ask them, like, what is this place? What happened here, right? And invariably, people will tell you, this is where the Armenians were thrown, this is the Armenians were killed, or this is where the Armenians fell. One of these three versions. So this man that I meet, after he tells me the story, sometimes I'm allowed to record it, so they let me record it, sometimes they don't, so they just tell me the story. So this guy actually let me record his testimony. And then, he said, now can you do me a favor? And I said, sure. And he says, so here's the thing. He says, my grandfather has a lot of Armenian artifacts that he has found. And these artifacts and items are made of copper. And he says, here's the thing. In our village, we believe that these artifacts were actually originally made of gold. And then, when the Armenians owned them. But then when we found them, they converted to copper. And we believe that if an Armenian comes and reads the Armenian language inscription on them, these artifacts are going to turn back to gold. So he says, will you do that for me? And of course, those of you who know me or those of you who just found out about me in the past hour, you will know that I would love to do miracles. If you can imagine, that would be a great thing for me to add to my resume. So I said yes. I was extremely curious because I had no idea what this guy is talking about. And then, so I said, okay. So he pulls out his cell phone, makes a few phone calls, and he says, follow me, right? He gets into his car, he's driving, and then I look at my friend and I say, I have no idea what's going to happen right now, but I'm willing to take the risk, right? So we jump in our van and we follow the guy. He takes us to the middle of nowhere in an open field and he says, wait here. And then pretty soon, half the village shows up carrying articles, different kinds of items in their hands for me to do that miracle. This is one picture from that experience that I absolutely love. You can go to town with this picture, right? That kid with the t-shirt, with the Che Guevara t-shirt, the whole thing, right? Now, it's important to ask why people would believe that. Why people would think that what they have is copper and it will never be fully valued unless their rightful owners show up one day. There's a word in this region called kismet. Ghasmet, you know? And this it's a very powerful word. What is meant for you? And that is what you're going to be taking with you and be able to enjoy fully. And if it's not meant for you, it's not meant for you. And at the same time, there's this inherent sense of guilt. Because you will never fully be able to appreciate something unless it is actually fully yours. And there's this realization that, you know, these artifacts are not theirs and they're not able to fully appreciate it. But there's something else as well. This guy wanted to rob the Armenians twice. He first got these artifacts, and then 100 years later, he found an Armenian, and he wanted him to turn it back to gold so that he takes the stuff away a second time. But ultimately, I tell this story because it is about the fact, it is a reminder of the fact that the past is very much with us. It is a reminder of the fact that this is not a story from history. This is not something that's completely divorced from our reality today. Both for Armenians and even more so for Turks. Thank you very much.